I'm 78 years old, and my family wants to hospitalize me, but I showed them that I'm not finished. When I turned 78 last spring, my daughter threw a small party for me in her backyard. It was modest, thoughtful, and filled with the smell of grilled chicken and cinnamon cake. My three grandkids ran circles around the table, and my son-in-law made awkward jokes about old age, as he always does. But beneath the laughter and the glass clinking, I sensed something else brewing, something like worry. I noticed the sideways glances between my children when I got up slowly or when I forgot a name for a moment. I caught my daughter whispering to her husband when I accidentally knocked over my water glass. They thought I was slipping. They thought the number on the cake was a warning sign. 2 weeks after the party, my eldest son Michael invited me over just to talk. I baked apple muffins and brought them in my old woven basket. His face tightened when he opened the door. I knew right then this wasn't going to be a chat over tea. He led me into the living room where his two sisters were waiting, sitting upright like they were attending a meeting. My heart sank. Michael sat beside me, took my hand, and said, "Mom, we've been talking and we think it's time you had some help, maybe even medical supervision. You've been forgetting things." I stared at them one by one, and they stared back with polite concern, the kind that makes you feel like a project. I tried to laugh it off. I told them that forgetting a name or two wasn't new for me, that I'd been doing that since I was 35. I told them I still cooked every day, volunteered twice a week, read books, and walked around the block like clockwork. They nodded, but I could tell none of it really registered. My daughter Sarah said, "We love you, Mom, but what if you fall again? What if you don't remember how to use the stove? This isn't about taking away your independence, it's about keeping you safe." I hated how reasonable it sounded. I hated how patronizing it felt. And I hated that a small part of me was afraid they might be right. They left me a pamphlet. It was thick, glossy, and had the word dignity in big blue letters across the top. There were photos of older people smiling while being fed soup or playing bingo. I couldn't even look at it. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen for hours, running my fingers over the cracks in the tile countertop, the same countertop I'd installed with my husband 4 decades ago. He would have told them to back off. He always said I was sharper than a tack and twice as dangerous. I missed him deeply at that moment, missed the sound of his voice telling me I was still the smartest person in the room. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled down a dusty box from my bedroom closet. Inside were my old ballet shoes, faded and cracked, and a stack of yellowing photos from my days as a dance teacher. There was one of me in mid-air, leaping across the stage during a performance of Giselle. I stared at it for a long time, then laughed bitterly. I couldn't do that anymore. But maybe I could still do something. Maybe I could remind myself and my children that I was still here, that I wasn't just a woman who forgot where she put her glasses. I started with yoga. At first, I watched YouTube videos in the living room, embarrassed by how stiff I was. But day by day, my muscles loosened. My back stopped aching. I started moving like I used to, not the same, but familiar. Then I pulled out my old stereo and played Chopin. I let the music flood my small apartment, closing my eyes, letting my hands trace the air like I was conducting a symphony. It felt ridiculous, but it also felt like something I hadn't felt in a long time. Alive! I ordered a ballet bar online. When it arrived, I cried unpacking it. It was as if I had invited back an old friend I thought had died. I didn't tell my children. I knew they'd worry. I knew they'd say it was dangerous or silly or both. So I trained in secret. Every morning at 6, I stood in my kitchen wearing black leggings and a tank top, the same kind I wore when I was 52. My cat, Pumpkin, would sit on the counter and watch as I did pliés, relevés, and tendus. The first time I attempted a pirouette, I nearly crashed into the fridge, but I laughed, not out of frustration, but joy, because I was trying, because my body remembered things I even forgot. A month passed, and I decided I was ready to show them. I called Michael and asked if I could host Sunday dinner this time. He hesitated but agreed. I made their favorite, rosemary chicken with garlic potatoes, and set the table with the old linen napkins my mother gave me. When they arrived, the house smelled of thyme and candle wax. They were surprised by how put together everything looked. I kept my secret until dessert. Then I stood up, pushed back the chairs, and told them I had something to show them. They looked at each other puzzled, but stayed seated. I moved to the center of the living room, where I had cleared the rug earlier that day. I turned on the stereo. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major began to play. Slowly, carefully, I started to dance. Nothing dramatic, just a series of soft movements, graceful and slow, with controlled steps and extended arms. My joints ached, but I didn't let it show. I moved with intention, with memory, with defiance. When I finished, the room was silent. Then I looked them each in the eye and said, "Don't you dare put me in a box. I'm not done yet." My daughter was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, when did you start doing this again?" I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. My son Michael remained frozen in his chair, his mouth half open, as if he couldn't decide whether to scold me or applaud me. My youngest, Clara, stood up slowly and walked toward me, hands clasped in front of her chest. She looked at me the way she used to when she was a child and I came home in costume after a performance, like I was someone capable of magic. In that moment, the power had shifted. I wasn't the fragile woman they were planning to warehouse into a hospital bed. I was their mother again, a force. "I started a few weeks ago," I told them calmly, brushing my hair back, my breath still heavy from the routine. I had to remind myself who I was, who I still am. The silence stretched between us like a thin wire ready to snap. Then Michael finally exhaled, stood up, and walked over to the stereo. He said, "That was impressive," almost reluctantly, "but Mom, you could have hurt yourself." I laughed, not to mock him, but because I expected that would be his first concern. "Michael," I said, "if I'm going to go out, I'd rather go out dancing than slowly forget myself in a beige room with nurses spoon-feeding the applesauce." We sat around the table again, although the food had cooled and the wine glasses had lost their condensation. We talked, not about safety or supervision, but about ballet, about how my body remembered things even I'd forgotten. I even dug out a few old VHS tapes and showed them clips of me dancing in a production of Swan Lake. The grandkids came in and sat on the carpet, jaws wide open. "Grandma, you are like a real ballerina," one of them shouted. "I still am," I said with a smile, "just a slower one." After they left, the house felt different. Not empty, but fuller somehow. Like I had reclaimed space that had been quietly stolen. I went into the kitchen, took off my shoes, and stood at the bar for one final round of pliés before bed. The next day, Sarah called and asked if I wanted to go shopping with her. When I said yes, she picked me up and didn't hover while I walked. She didn't reach for my elbow or talk to me like I was made of porcelain. For the first time in years, I felt like I had shaken something loose in them. A spell of ageism, maybe, or just the fog of overprotection that adult children sometimes get caught in. But just as things were settling, I got a call from Michael 2 days later. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice light. "So I've been thinking, if you're serious about this whole dance thing again, maybe we should do something with it. I mean, you're not just staying active, you're inspiring people." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. I've got a friend who runs a YouTube channel. He does videos on unusual life stories, real feel-good stuff. I told him about you, and Well, he wants to film you. Thinks it could be something big. I paused. The thought of being on camera at my age was horrifying, but there was a flutter in my chest. That strange feeling of possibility. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, wearing a leotard for the first time in over 2 decades. My arms weren't as firm and the lines on my neck were deeper, but my posture was still solid. My eyes still sparkled with that old fire. I turned sideways, lifted my chin, and tried a slow pirouette. My hip cracked halfway through, but I landed it. Then I looked at my reflection and said out loud, "You're not done yet. Not even close." The next morning, I called Michael and said, "Let's do it. But on one condition, I'm in control of the story." The camera crew arrived a week later. Just 2 young guys with soft eyes and a quiet reverence for the elderly. They filmed me warming up in the morning, feeding Pumpkin, making tea, then dancing slowly to Debussy while sunlight filtered in through the curtains. They asked me questions, too, about my life, my children, my fears. At first I was hesitant, but something about being seen, truly seen, made it easier. I told them how I had once danced on a broken toe because the understudy froze, how I used to tape notes to my students' lockers, cheering them on before exams, how I stopped dancing after my husband died because the music made me cry. The video went live on a Tuesday. By Friday, it had over 2 million views. The comments poured in from people of all ages, teenagers who missed their grandparents, middle-aged women who felt invisible, men who said they cried watching me move. "She dances like memory itself," one comment read. "She reminds me that it's never too late," wrote another. My inbox was flooded. Invitations to speak at events, dance studios asking if I could come teach, even a yoga studio that wanted to offer me a space to host senior ballet classes. It was overwhelming, but it was also electrifying. Suddenly, I wasn't just a 78-year-old woman fighting to keep her independence. I was a symbol, a rebel in leggings, a reminder that age doesn't have to be a cage. I printed out the comments and pinned them to the corkboard in my hallway. Every morning, I read one before my warm-up. It became a ritual, a form of armor. Then one day, Sarah came over and asked, "Mom, what would you think about starting your own channel? Something where people could follow your journey, get inspired, maybe even dance with you." I looked at her and smiled. "Only if you'll be in the first video." We filmed the first video on a quiet Sunday morning. The living room was bright with natural light, the curtains pulled back, and the stereo humming a soft prelude from Tchaikovsky. Sarah stood next to me, dressed in black leggings and a loose sweater. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear and shifted her weight from foot to foot. "Mom," she whispered, "what if I mess up?" I touched her hand gently and said, "We're not here to be perfect. We're here to move, to feel alive." That seemed to settle her. The camera was set on a tripod, angled just right, and with a deep breath, we began. The video was simple. We called it Dancing Through Generations. It began with us side by side at the Bear, me showing her the basics, plie, tendu, port de bras, and her laughing at how stiff she felt. We kept it real, unpolished. When she lost her balance, we laughed. When I had to pause to stretch my knees, she helped me stand straight. We closed the video with a slow, improvised routine, our hands mirroring each other's like a conversation without words. When we reviewed the footage, I could barely speak. I saw more than just a video. I saw healing, legacy, and something that went deeper than views or clicks. We posted it on my new channel, which we titled Not Done Yet. The name came from something I had said to the camera crew weeks before, when they asked what message I wanted people to take from my story. I'd said it plainly, like a truth that lived in my bones. I'm not done yet. Within hours, the video began to gain traction. By the end of the day, It had over 50,000 views. I refreshed the page constantly, surprised each time by the growing number. I never thought I'd live to see strangers from across the world watching me dance from their phones and laptops. But here I was. The comments were different this time, more personal. Women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s wrote paragraphs about how they'd given up on movement, on beauty, on the feeling of flow in their own bodies. A woman in Brazil said she used to dance as a girl, but stopped after she had children. Now she wanted to try again. A man in Korea shared a story about his mother who had passed away before she ever followed her dream of teaching music. The stories poured in like a river, and with each one, I felt less alone. My story wasn't unique. It was a mirror. That week, Clara, my youngest, came over with a stack of notebooks and a laptop. "I have an idea," she said, setting the items down on my dining table. "Let's create a program, like a beginner's guide for people over 50 who want to dance again." At first, I laughed. What do I know about creating a program? But she was serious. "You know everything about dance, Mom. I know how to organize. We'll make a good team." The idea terrified me, but there was a part of me, old but still fierce, that lit up at the challenge. So we began. We met every morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Clara typed while I demonstrated. We broke down everything into digestible steps. Warm-ups, simple bear work, breathing exercises, tips for those with arthritis or bad knees. We named it Grace in Motion and structured it like a journey. 5 weeks of movement, ending with a solo routine that students could customize. We filmed each section in my living room, using just natural light and a secondhand tripod. I wore my old leotards and Clara edited out the background creaks in my knees. It was humble, homemade, but full of soul. When we released the first week of Grace in Motion on my channel, I expected a few dozen downloads. Instead, we had over 5,000 within the first 48 hours. People from every continent joined in. We saw footage of women dancing on balconies in Greece, on porches in Alabama, on rooftops in Tokyo. Some sent messages with tears in their eyes. One woman wrote, "I used to be afraid of mirrors. Now I dance in front of one every morning, just to see myself smile." Another said, "You brought me back to life, Eleanor." That was the first time someone used my name online. It made it all feel real. Still, I kept my mornings private. Even with the videos and the channel and the comments, I needed that hour to myself. At 6 a.m., when the house was quiet and the sky was soft with dawn, I moved in silence. No cameras, no corrections, just me and the music. I listened to how my body responded, where it tightened, where it opened. I paid attention to my breath. Some mornings I cried. Other mornings I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. But every morning I danced. Because even with the world watching, I was doing this for me first. And yet, with all the joy, came the whispers of doubt. At the grocery store, someone asked if I had a caregiver. At the bank, a teller offered to explain online statements slowly, assuming I didn't understand. The world still saw me as a number, a category, elderly, frail, slowing down. And that made me push harder, because the truth is, the most radical thing a woman over 70 can do is take up space, move boldly, speak loudly, show her body without shame. And that's exactly what I plan to keep doing. The invitations started coming in around the time the fourth video on the channel hit 1 million views. At first, it was small things. Community centers asking if I could zoom into their senior movement class, local newspapers asking for quotes, schools wanting to feature me during their wellness week. Then came the bigger ones. A regional talk show in Chicago, a TEDx organizer in Minneapolis, a documentary filmmaker from London. Each message made my hands tremble with disbelief. I sat at my kitchen table,
rereading them until the words felt like fiction. I was just a woman who decided not to disappear. That was all. And suddenly the world couldn't look away. Clara and Sarah sat me down and suggested we get some help. You need someone who can handle all this, Sarah said. Emails, contracts, media, you need a team. I rolled my eyes. A team? What, like I'm Beyoncé now? Clara laughed but nodded. Not Beyoncé, but you're building something. You've got a platform. It's time we protected it. I was skeptical. I didn't want agents or handlers or anyone filtering what I said. But after a week of replying to over 200 emails myself, I caved. We found a young woman named Anika who had helped other older influencers manage their presence. She was sharp, efficient, and most importantly, she listened. With Anika's help, we organized a live virtual class. We called it Sunday Grace and invited our subscribers to join via a link we posted a few days before. I expected maybe 200 people to tune in. Instead, we had over 6,000. 6,000 people watching in real time from living rooms and backyards and kitchen floors. Some wear leg warmers, others pajamas. A woman danced with her cane. A man joined in from a hospital bed. When I logged on and saw all their tiny, eager faces on the screen grid, I had to cover my mouth to keep from sobbing. It was a congregation of joy. We began the session with slow breathing and grounding movements. Then I led them through some basic steps, reminding them to listen to their bodies, to honor their limits. We closed with a few minutes of improvisation, and I told them, forget the steps. Just move the way you wish someone would have let you when you were young. The screen filled with motion. Awkward, graceful, slow, wild. One woman twirled with her dog, another rocked gently in a chair, eyes closed, fingers fluttering like leaves. We weren't just exercising. We were remembering, reclaiming. After the class, the emails changed. They became longer, more intimate. People told me about trauma, about being silenced, ignored, minimized, about how their bodies had become battlegrounds for shame and regret. One woman wrote, I spent my whole life being told to sit still, be small. When I danced with you, I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time. I printed that one and taped it next to the mirror where I practiced. Every time I read it, I stood taller. But the attention brought critics too. Not many, but loud enough to echo. Some said I was irresponsible, that encouraging movement in elderly people was dangerous, that I was romanticizing aging. One comment read, this is a sweet story, but let's be honest, she'll break a hip and the whole thing will end in tears. I stared at that comment for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it was so small-minded. It was everything I'd spent my life fighting against. So I responded not with anger, but with clarity. If I fall, I'll get up. But if I don't try, I disappear. I'd rather fall. I didn't tell the kids about that comment until weeks later. When I finally did, Michael offered to hunt the person down and reason with them. I told him to leave it. Not everyone would get it. That was okay. I wasn't doing this for the critics. I was doing it for the woman in Boston who just signed up for her first adult dance class at 62. For the man in New Zealand who emailed to say that watching me made him want to pick up his guitar again. For the woman in Morocco who said she danced with me in secret behind closed curtains while her grandchildren napped. This was bigger than me. The momentum continued. Anika secured a feature in a national magazine, one of those glossy lifestyle ones with pastel covers and names like Living Well. The photographer wanted a cover shoot, which felt ridiculous. Me, on a cover? What kind of world are we living in? But I agreed. We did the shoot in my backyard, the photographer using soft light and warm tones. She asked me to leap, to stretch my arms, to move naturally. I did a simple arabesque beside my garden roses, barefoot in the grass. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When the magazine arrived in the mail, I barely recognized myself, but I liked the woman on that cover. She looked like she had something to say. And maybe that's what this whole thing was about. Not dancing, not YouTube, but saying something, claiming space, declaring that aging isn't a retreat, but a revolution, that life doesn't taper down into a narrow hallway of fear and memory loss, that sometimes the second act is the one that makes the audience rise to their feet. I stood in front of the mirror that evening, still in my photo shoot outfit, and whispered to my reflection, "You are not a relic. You are a spark." Then I turned off the light and slept with a smile I hadn't worn in years.
The day I was invited to speak at the community college's spring convocation, I nearly dropped the phone in my cereal. The dean herself called and said their keynote speaker had canceled last minute, and a professor had suggested they reach out to the dancing grandmother from YouTube. I chuckled at the title, but her tone was sincere. "You've changed the way my mother sees herself," she said. "She dances with you every Sunday." That was enough for me to say yes, even though public speaking had never been my strength. I could perform choreography in front of hundreds, but put me on a podium with a microphone, and I'd rather run laps barefoot on gravel. The days leading up to the speech were filled with nerves. Clara offered to help write it, but I told her I needed to find the words myself. I spent hours pacing the house, jotting sentences on index cards, reading them aloud to Pumpkin, who stared at me like I'd lost my mind. I kept circling one core idea: what it means to be visible again, to be seen after decades of being overlooked, boxed in, labeled. I wanted those young students to understand that youth is not the beginning and end of vitality, that sometimes fire takes years to build its brightest flame. The day of the speech, I wore a deep plum blazer and black slacks. Sarah insisted on doing my makeup, which felt indulgent, but I let her. "You're about to be the fiercest person in that gymnasium," she said, brushing my cheeks with just a touch of rouge. I laughed, but inside I was shaking. When we arrived, the students were already filling the seats, their faces curious and amused. I'm sure many expected some cliché speech about wisdom and aging gracefully. But when I stepped up to the microphone and told them, at 78, I started dancing again, and the world started listening, the room went still. I spoke for 20 minutes. I told them about losing my husband, about the fear of disappearing into the shadows of old age, about the decision to move my body again, even when it hurt, about the risk of being seen. I shared how I started each day with breath and movement, not because I had something to prove, but because it reminded me I was alive. I told them not to waste time waiting to be perfect before they tried something brave. And when I finished, I stood silently for a few seconds, scanning the crowd. They stood. They clapped. Some even cried. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was resonance. Afterwards, a line of students formed to speak with me. A young man with tattoos on his hands told me his grandmother was just diagnosed with Parkinson's and asked if I could send her a message. A girl with tears in her eyes said she'd been afraid to pursue dance because she didn't fit the look. Another shyly asked if I could teach a short class for their drama club. My heart swelled with every conversation. It hit me then, my movement was causing movement, not just in limbs and muscles, but in hearts, in beliefs, in self-worth. That evening, when I got home, I sat down and wrote a letter to my younger self. It began, "Dear Eleanor, you are not invisible. Not now, not ever." I didn't stop writing for over an hour.
I wrote about fear, failure, loss, and rediscovery. I wrote about the pain of watching your reflection age while your soul remains hungry. I wrote about the courage it takes to start again, not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle of everything when most people expect you to be done. And then I folded the letter, tucked it into an envelope, and placed it in my old jewelry box. For safekeeping, for someone to find one day. The next Sunday, our virtual class reached over 10,000 live participants. Anika couldn't stop smiling. "You're a movement now," she said, "not just a woman." I didn't quite know what that meant. I wasn't trying to start a revolution. I just didn't want to be forgotten. But maybe that's how revolutions start. Quietly, personally, from a single heartbeat refusing to slow down. That class, I did something different. I invited people to send in short videos of themselves dancing. We made a montage, a mosaic of motion. Young, old, stiff, fluid, joyful. Watching it brought me to tears. It was proof that movement belongs to everyone. As the channel grew, we received an invitation from a wellness retreat in California. They wanted me to headline a week-long program for intergenerational healing through movement. They said, "We'll fly you first class." I declined the first-class ticket. I told them I preferred economy. I liked being with the people, hearing their stories, watching how they looked at me with curiosity, then respect. When I arrived at the retreat, I was greeted with applause I hadn't earned yet. But by the end of the week, after the workshops, the barefoot morning practices, the fireside talks, they understood that I wasn't there to be admired. I was there to dance with them. One evening, near the end of the retreat, a woman my age approached me during dinner. Her voice shook. She said, "I've lived quietly for so long, taking care of others, forgetting myself. Watching your videos, it's like someone reached into the silence and said, 'I see you.'" I hugged her. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because I knew exactly what she meant. We don't always need permission to be bold, but sometimes we need a witness. And in that moment, I realized I had become that witness for thousands. When I returned from the retreat, my house felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I moved differently. I breathed deeper. I looked out the window not just to watch the world go by, but to imagine myself stepping into it, participating in it with full authority. The house, once quiet and filled with gentle routines, was now a headquarters for something much larger than me. Clara was waiting at the kitchen table, eyes sparkling, laptop open. She said, "We've been offered a book deal," before I even took off my coat. I laughed out loud. What on earth would I write in a book? She closed the laptop, took my hand and said, "Everything." That night, I sat with a blank journal in my lap, the kind with the thick cream pages that smell like hope. I didn't know where to start, so I wrote one word: begin. And then slowly it came out, not in order, not with structure, but in moments. Teaching my first ballet class at 29 in a dusty studio with cracked mirrors, crying in the shower after my husband's funeral, feeling like I'd been erased, laughing so hard with my grandchildren that my ribs ached, watching my own body betray me, then forgive me, then remember me. Each story felt like a breadcrumb back to myself. The publisher wanted a ghostwriter, but I said no. If people are going to hear my voice, they should hear it from me, even if it's a little messy. It took 6 months of long afternoons, sore wrists, and tear-streaked pages. But I wrote it. We titled it Still Dancing. The cover was simple. A black and white image of me mid-movement, arms open like an offering. When the advance copies arrived, I sat on the porch, the book in my lap, unable to open it for several minutes. Holding it felt like holding a piece of truth that had waited decades to be told. Meanwhile, the channel continued to grow. Our subscribers passed 200,000. We started a monthly series called Grace Circles, where women over 60 shared their stories of rediscovery. Some danced, some painted, some simply spoke. One woman, aged 84, read a poem she'd written the day after her divorce was finalized. Another, 71, demonstrated martial arts forms she had learned from her granddaughter. Each session was raw and beautiful and painfully real. And each reminded me that aging is not a descent, it's a return. A return to who we were before the world told us what we couldn't be.
Despite all the joy, I started to notice my energy waning. Small things at first. Fatigue after teaching a class. A persistent ache in my hip that didn't go away after stretching. Clara insisted I see a doctor. I resisted for weeks, until one morning I tried to do a simple tendu and couldn't lift my foot without pain. The doctor was kind but blunt. "You're strong, Eleanor, but your body is changing. We need to monitor this carefully." I nodded, swallowing the fear like a bitter pill. I didn't tell the followers right away. I needed time to process the idea that even the fiercest spirit lives inside a vulnerable body. Eventually, I made a video. I sat in my favorite chair with Pumpkin curled beside me and spoke directly to the camera. "Aging isn't a story with one happy chapter," I said. "It's a novel with twists and valleys. And right now, I'm in one of those valleys. But that doesn't mean I stop moving. It just means I move differently." I didn't cry. I wanted people to see the strength in adjusting, in being honest about limits without surrendering passion. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in, not pity, but solidarity. "Thank you for showing us the full picture," someone wrote. "Not just the light, but the shadows too." That winter, I started working with a physical therapist. She was young, bright-eyed, and respectfully tough. "We're not going to baby you," she said, "but we're going to be smart." We focused on strength training, posture, joint mobility. I had to adjust my routines, slow them down, modify certain movements. But what surprised me most was how my body responded. It didn't resent me. It cooperated. Like an old friend saying, "All right, let's do this again, your way." I came to understand that reinvention doesn't always mean doing something new. Sometimes it means doing the same thing in a way that honors where you are now. During that period, I created a new series called Movement in Stillness. It wasn't about dancing in the traditional sense. It was about subtle, intentional gestures, hand choreography, breath patterns, the emotional rhythm of presence. We filmed them in black and white, with soft piano in the background. It felt like prayer. The audience responded deeply. "This saved me," one woman wrote. "I have limited mobility, but I can do this. And I feel beautiful." That comment stayed with me. Beauty had never been a word I associated with stillness. Until now. One afternoon, Sarah came over with a bundle of letters. Actual letters, not emails, not comments. Handwritten envelopes from around the world. People who didn't want to send their stories digitally. They came from nursing homes, prisons, rural towns with no internet. I read each one slowly, reverently. A man in his 90s said he danced with his wife every morning to our videos, even though she couldn't remember his name anymore. A teenager in Canada said her grandmother watched all my classes
and started wearing earrings again. These weren't just fans, they were companions, fellow travelers in this late-blooming garden of movement. Spring arrived with a quiet promise, longer days, softer mornings, and the smell of lilac blooming near my back fence. I started waking up before the sun again, not because I had to, but because it felt sacred. I'd sit by the window with tea in hand, watching the light slowly paint the world back into color. There's something about being alive at this age that sharpens your senses. You stop taking things for granted. The wind through your fingers, the way shadows stretch across the wall, the sensation of your feet on the ground, all of it becomes a kind of worship. I wasn't just dancing anymore. I was listening to the world, to myself. The physical therapy was working. My range of motion improved, the pain in my hips softened into something manageable, and I felt strong again. Not in the way I had at 30, but in a way that felt wiser. Clara kept updating our subscribers, calling it my resurgence chapter. We even made a video series about adapting movement for fluctuating energy levels. Some days you dance, and some days you sway in your chair and let the music move inside you. Both are valid. Both are sacred. That series struck a chord with many. People with chronic pain or mental illness began to write to say they finally felt included. By now, my story had gone far beyond my control. It appeared in textbooks, in podcasts, in art projects. A filmmaker from Denmark made a short documentary titled Still in Flight, using clips of my early videos, my interviews, and reenactments of my younger self dancing across an empty theater stage. I didn't like seeing myself dramatized like that. It felt distant, like someone else's life. But I respected the filmmaker's vision. The message was clear. Transformation is possible, even when the world expects you to shrink. I watched it once and then asked Clara to file it away. I didn't need to look back again. I was too busy living forward. Around this time, my grandchildren began showing a new kind of interest in my work. The youngest, Olivia, started attending dance classes. She said it was to be like grandma but in Nikes. My heart nearly burst hearing that. My eldest grandson, Jamie, offered to help me create a video game-style app, something playful that would encourage movement in older adults. He'll call it Groove Mode, he said, grinning. At first, I thought he was joking, but a month later, he came back with a prototype. It was clever, colorful, and intuitive. Watching my grandkids engage with movement because of me, that was the kind of legacy I hadn't even dared to imagine. The book launched quietly, without a flashy tour or viral campaign, just a few interviews, a local library event, and a dedicated section on the YouTube channel. But it found its readers. I began receiving letters not just about the dancing videos, but about the book's stories, especially the painful ones. "Thank you for writing about widowhood," one woman wrote. "No one ever told me it would feel like losing oxygen." Another said, "Your chapter about forgetting yourself hit me the hardest. I forgot myself for 20 years. Thank you for showing me the way back." I cried reading that one because I wrote that chapter late one night, alone, afraid it was too raw. That summer, a school in Vermont reached out to say they had included excerpts from my story in a course about aging and identity. "The students are fascinated," the teacher wrote. "Would you consider visiting us virtually?" Of course I said yes. When I logged onto the Zoom call, I saw 20 bright faces, mostly college freshmen, all curious, all quiet. One young woman raised her hand and asked, "Do you think aging has made you more free?" I smiled and said, "Absolutely, because I no longer live to impress anyone. I live to express something true. That is a kind of freedom I never knew when I was 20. One night, during a rare moment of solitude, I went up to the attic and found an old box of journals. Most were from my 30s and 40s, written in a rushed hand between diaper changes, dance recitals, and late-night arguments about bills. I read one entry aloud to myself. I feel like I'm vanishing, like no one sees me anymore. I want to scream, but I can't afford the silence that would follow. It broke my heart. That younger version of me had no idea what was waiting for her decades down the road. If only I could have sent her a whisper across time. Hold on, you're not disappearing. You're just preparing for something extraordinary.
It was around then that I got an idea. A dance solo. Not for the channel, not for the world, just for me. A culmination of everything I'd lived, felt, lost, and reclaimed. I choreographed it slowly, in pieces. A reach here, a fall there, a pause for grief, a turn for joy. I didn't plan to record it. I just wanted to perform it once, in my living room. No audience, no applause. Just me, the music, and the life I had danced through. It took 3 weeks to finish. I practiced each section every morning, fine-tuning transitions, listening to how my body responded, what it wanted to say. And then one day, without announcing it, without preparing the lights or setting the camera, I danced it through, from beginning to end. No edits, no retries. I cried halfway through, but kept going. When it was done, I collapsed into the chair, breathless. Pumpkin jumped onto my lap and nestled in. I sat there for a long time, not because I was tired, but because I felt complete. Like I had finally told the truth, not in words, not in sentences, but in motion, in gesture, in presence. A few days after I danced that final solo in my living room, I received a call from a woman named Dr. Helena Ruiz, an aging and movement researcher at a major university. She spoke softly, but with conviction. She told my story had been included in a seminar on embodied memory, and students were blown away by how dance could store emotion, trauma, and resilience. You've sparked an academic inquiry we didn't know we needed, she said. Would you be willing to speak at our symposium? I laughed gently. I'm not an academic, I replied. She answered, that's exactly why we want you. And just like that, I found myself preparing to speak to a room full of scholars. The symposium was held in a quiet corner of the university, a vaulted hall with big windows and a wood floor that reminded me of the first dance studio I ever trained in. When I stepped onto the stage, my nerves trembled in my chest. But then, I looked out and saw the room not as critics, but as listeners, seekers, people curious about how someone like me, ordinary, overlooked, aging, had stirred something new in the world. I didn't prepare a slideshow. I simply spoke about how movement gave me my voice back, about how the body stores every joy, every loss, like a personal library of experience. After I finished, a professor in the audience stood up and said, Miss Hayes, your body is an archive. I smiled at that. I'd never thought of it that way, but he was right. My joints carried stories. My scars were citations. My movements were footnotes in a language older than academia. I was more than a woman who danced. I was a living manuscript. A few students approached me afterwards asking if I could lead a movement seminar the next semester. Not dance necessarily, one of them clarified. Just movement, freedom, like you show us online. I said I'd think about it, but in my heart, I already knew the answer. Back home, I found myself quieter. Not sad, just contemplative. The kind of silence that comes when you've said what you needed to say and are simply waiting to see what echoes back. I still danced, but now with less urgency, less need for validation. The views and the comments and the analytics had started to feel peripheral. What mattered was how I felt when I moved, how grounded I became, how I could feel my husband's presence when the music swelled, how I could feel my former selves, the scared wife, the tired mother, the forgotten widow, all watching me from the corners of the room, smiling.
One morning, Sarah brought over a printed schedule. She said, "We're going to slow things down a bit. Fewer interviews, more recovery days. Your body needs time to rest too." I nodded. I had already been feeling it. Not just the physical wear, but the emotional saturation. I had been carrying so many stories, not just my own, but thousands of others sent to me like offerings. It was an honor, but it was heavy. So we cleared 2 weeks on the calendar, and I took a digital sabbatical. No filming, no posting, just long walks, journaling, and time in the garden. During those 2 weeks, I planted lavender, chamomile, and sweet basil. Clara joined me, helping me pull weeds and prepare soil. She said, "It's like choreography. Everything has rhythm." I liked that. We spent hours with our hands in the dirt, not saying much, just being. I remembered how movement didn't always have to be grand. Sometimes it was in the way you kneel to the earth, the way you water something fragile, the way you rise slowly, brush off your knees, and take a breath. There was dance in that too. Quiet dance, rooted dance. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not an email, but a handwritten letter, folded neatly in a lilac envelope. It was from a woman named Beatrice in Oregon. She had just turned 83 and written to tell me that she had staged a performance in her assisted living home. "Nothing fancy," she wrote. "Just me, a few friends, and the dining room. We danced to Moon River in our nightgowns and slippers. Someone filmed it. The staff clapped." At the bottom, she wrote, "You gave me back the part of myself I thought had died." I cried reading that. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition. This was what it was all for. As the summer drew near, I began planning a new series, one that had nothing to do with choreography. I called it The Return. It would be a collection of letters, reflections, and slow movements for people who felt like life had passed them by. I wanted it to feel like a whisper, like someone sitting beside you and saying, "You're still here. Let's begin again." Claire and I worked quietly on it, filming in golden light, recording voiceovers, choosing music that made you want to breathe deeper. It was the most vulnerable project I had ever made. But it felt necessary, like medicine. And then, almost suddenly, I was invited to Paris. A dance festival focusing on artists over 65 had heard about my channel. They wanted me to open the festival with a keynote and a short performance. My jaw dropped. Me? Paris? At 79? My children nearly exploded with excitement. Clara began helping with travel logistics. Sarah immediately offered to go with me. She said, "We'll make it a mother-daughter trip. You've earned this." That night, I stood in front of the mirror, holding the invitation in my hand. I looked at my reflection, not for flaws, but for truth. "You," I whispered, "are going to dance in Paris."
Paris was not what I remembered from my honeymoon in 1971. It was louder, faster, somehow both older and newer. But as I stepped onto the cobbled streets, arm in arm with Sarah, I felt something awaken inside me. Not nostalgia, but possibility. The smell of butter and stone in the morning air, the low hum of conversations in cafes, the faint music drifting from accordion players in the metro. It was a city still in motion, and that made me feel at home. We stayed in a modest hotel near Montmartre. My room had a small balcony where I practiced morning stretches in view of a flowering chestnut tree. Sarah took photos, laughing as I struck poses in my robe, arms lifted like I was greeting the sunrise. The festival was held in an airy performance center along the Seine. There were dancers from Japan, Brazil, Germany, and Nigeria. Some used wheelchairs, others moved like silk on fire. We were all there for the same reason, to remind the world that artistry doesn't expire. I was scheduled for the second night, 20 minutes to speak, followed by a 5-minute piece I had choreographed just days before. I called it Memory on Fire. It wasn't complex, just honest. A mix of slow rotations, held breath, sudden gestures like sparks of recollection.
I wore simple gray silk and danced barefoot under amber lights. As the final note faded, I stood still, hands at my heart, the room hushed into reverence. The applause came slowly, then all at once. Not thunderous, but warm, human, real. Afterwards, dancers I'd never met hugged me like I was kin. A man in his 70s, with a limp and tears in his eyes, whispered, "Merci pour le courage." Thank you for the courage. Sarah couldn't stop crying. "Mom," she kept saying, "do you even realize what you've done?" But in that moment, it wasn't about what I'd done. It was about where I was, who I had become. A woman who refused to shrink. A woman who had reclaimed her body not as a relic, but as a living instrument of truth. The next morning, we walked along the river as fog lifted over the water. I told Sarah how terrified I had been that night before going on stage. "I almost backed out," I admitted. She looked at me, eyes wide. "You? After everything?" I nodded. "That never goes away, sweetheart, but you learn to dance with it. Fear is part of the choreography." We spent that day visiting a small museum dedicated to female artists over 50. I stood in front of a painting of an old woman seated in a forest, brush in hand, eyes closed. The plaque read, "She creates in the quiet years, where others forget to look." I felt like I knew her. Back home, the channel surged again. Clips from the Paris performance were shared thousands of times. Someone even animated parts of my routine, turning my slow turns into glowing brushstrokes on screen. It was surreal, but I didn't chase that momentum. I let it settle. I had no interest in becoming a brand. I had become something more meaningful. An anchor for people adrift in a culture that worships youth and erases wisdom. A reminder that life doesn't close with age, it ripens. Not always sweetly, but deeply, fully. That fall, I turned 80. We held a quiet gathering in my backyard, just family, a few neighbors, and the soft sound of Chopin playing on a Bluetooth speaker. There were no speeches, no candles to blow out, just a gentle toast, some homemade pastries, and laughter that sounded like home. My grandchildren gave me a handmade scrapbook filled with photos from the last 3 years, each one captioned with a quote from my videos. On the last page, they'd written in big letters, "We love you because you danced, but we admire you because you refused to disappear." Later that evening, when everyone had gone home and the garden lights had flickered off, I sat alone on the porch. The stars were clear, the wind was soft, and my body, tired, but still faithful, ached in familiar places. I thought about all I had done since that day Michael sat me down with the pamphlet about supervised care. I had not only proven I was not finished, I had become someone entirely new, and yet more myself than ever before. That pamphlet was still tucked in a drawer, somewhere beneath the ballet shoes and old letters. I had kept it as a reminder, not of their doubt, but of the door I chose not to walk through. Now, I teach once a week. I write when I feel like it. I garden often. I dance every morning, even if only with my fingers and breath. My YouTube channel still lives on, but it no longer defines me. It is simply an echo of a decision I made to live fully, fiercely, unapologetically. People still write to me from places I'll never visit, in languages I don't speak. And in every message, there is one shared phrase, one truth that connects them all. You reminded me, I'm not done yet. And neither am I. Not today, not tomorrow. As long as there is music, as long as there is breath, I will move. Because I am not finished.